All right, in this screencast, we're going to talk about succession. Succession is the gradual changing of communities, of the populations in a given environment because of changes in the environment. But before we can talk about succession, we need to talk about limiting factors. The subtitle here says all living organisms are limited by factors in the environment. We'll talk about what that means. Okay, a limiting factor is any biotic or abiotic part of the environment that restricts the reproduction or distribution of a population. For example, all populations have a limit to how large they can get. What prevents them from getting bigger? Usually it's something like food. There's not enough food for the population to get any larger. Sometimes it's space. Sometimes it's access to other things like light or water. In this ecosystem, the turtle, where the cacti and the turtle are, the limiting factor is water, and that limits how many turtles can survive there, how many cacti can survive there. Okay, now in this ecosystem, there's completely different limiting factors. See if you can figure them out. Before I explain them to you, let's go over two quick vocabulary words. The first word is canopy. The canopy is the upper part of the forest. It's the cover formed by the leafy upper branches, as opposed to the understory. The understory includes the shrubs and the plants growing beneath the canopy. So use what you know about limiting factors. What do you suppose is the most important limiting factor for the understory, the shrubs that are growing beneath? Well, the limiting factor is probably light, access to light. Now, this is a question not all of you will know the answer. What important biogeochemical cycle limits the growth of most producers, especially in aquatic ecosystems? If you're in the ecology class, you may have studied this. If you're in the genetics class, you may not have. Aquatic ecosystems are usually limited by the presence of phosphorus. Okay, so we said earlier that the whole point of a limiting factor is that it limits the population. So what is that population limit? What's the maximum the population can ever achieve? That's called the carrying capacity. So the maximum population size for a species that the environment can support is its carrying capacity. CC, carrying capacity, is restricted by limiting factors. Examples of limiting factors would be food, light, water, shelter, other nutrients, predators, etc. All right, so take a look at the graph. You can see the carrying capacity somewhere around 1.5 million. Notice that the population wavers up and down around that, but it's still pretty much staying around the carrying capacity, which is 1.5 million. Now, here's a word that might be new to some of you, extrapolate. To extrapolate means to sort of read into a graph with the data that's there. Can you figure out what would happen in the future or what's not specifically stated in the graph? If nothing changes in the environment, where would the population be in 1950? And again, we would guess somewhere around 1.5 million, because that's the carrying capacity for whatever that population is. Okay, the carrying capacity is dependent on an organism's range of tolerance. How much food do they need to survive? How much oxygen do they need to survive? What temperatures can they survive? Is it a range of temperatures or only a very specific temperature? So the range of tolerance is defined as an upper and lower limit that describe the conditions under which an organism can survive. If you take a look at the graph, the range of tolerance for dissolved oxygen in fish, so how they're able to survive, whether they're able to survive. So it says, where does the zone of intolerance for fish and dissolved oxygen levels begin? And that's about 3 parts per million, ppm, that's what it means. And where is the zone of physiological stress? And that's about 3 to 5 parts per million if you look on the graph. Okay, I like this example that's taken straight from the book describing range of tolerance because it reminds me of the aquarium that we have in our classroom. Notice that what happens to the fish population depending on the temperatures. Just like in my aquarium in the classroom, it has to be kept at a certain temperature. If I allow the temperature to get too low or too high, the fish die. The population survives best within a very specific and small temperature range. So then the bottom says, where would you find the carrying capacity on this graph? Well, the carrying capacity is the maximum number within that range of tolerance. So it is the blue line, that bell curve that you see here. That's the range of tolerance. That's the carrying capacity. So at the ideal temperatures, you see the highest carrying capacity. But when you get very cold temperatures or very warm temperatures, notice that the carrying capacity drops significantly. All right, now that we've had the background information, we're ready to talk about what ecological succession is exactly. I introduced it at the beginning, but it's defined as the change that happens when one community, a population of different plants, animals, organisms, gradually replaces another because of changes in the environment. Primary succession is defined as the first community ever. There's no topsoil initially. Nobody has ever lived in that environment before. That's primary succession. One of the few examples of primary succession is after a volcano. When the lava cools, there's never been a plant there. There's no topsoil there initially. When over time, organisms start to live there, plants start to break down the rock, and you start to form a thin layer of soil. That's called primary succession. Secondary succession is what occurs after a major disturbance like a fire or after construction work, when an environment is destroyed, but then it comes back. The difference between primary and secondary succession is that secondary succession already has topsoil, often it already has seeds, and so it moves along much faster. It's a much faster process than the primary succession was. Okay, let's take a look at primary succession in more detail. Again, this is what happens when nothing has ever lived there before, when you're forming an environment or forming a population on an ecosystem that has no topsoil and never had living organisms. The first thing that has to happen is soil formation. You start out with lichens and mosses, which is what that photograph is of, growing on bare rock. The lichens and mosses are called pioneer species. That's an important vocabulary word. They secrete acids that actually break down the rock. And as they break down the rock, and as they die, and as they break down the rock, and they die, and they break down the rock, they create the very first soil. So the dead plant matter and broken rock leads to the very first soil. Once some soil has formed, small herbaceous or green plants and ferns, fungi, and insects can start to live in that environment. And as they live and die and live and die, and their roots break up more and more soil forms. Eventually, when the soil becomes thick enough, shrubs and even shade-intolerant tree species begin to grow. Shade-intolerant means they can't tolerate shade, so they can only grow in sunlight. If another tree grows over it, that tree dies. So the first ones to arrive are the shrubs and shade-intolerant trees. The gradual replacing of one community of trees by another, usually as a result of differences in shade tolerance. So as taller trees move in, as more shade tolerant trees move in, the original shade intolerant trees disappear. Okay, we'll just quickly talk about how forest succession happens, which is very similar but a little bit different than what we've just been talking about. Okay, the process of one community of trees replacing another community of trees is called forest succession. Eventually, that replacement ends with what's called a climax species. These are the most shade-tolerant tree species that are native to a particular region. All right, at the beginning of forest succession, pioneer species, small pioneer trees, quickly occupy a site following a clearing. They grow rapidly and to compete with grasses and shrubs, but notice there are no shade trees already present. As those pioneer species grow, the crowns of the pioneer species close, and the seedlings from these trees, they drop down. They're unable to survive in the resulting shade, so they don't replace themselves in that exact location. Instead, different species that have a higher tolerance to shade soon become established beneath the pioneers, and they start to grow. The pioneer species tend to be short-lived, and as they near the end of their lifespans, the more tolerant trees in the forest understory begin to take over the site. The result is a major change in plant and animal species. Here's an example from northern Minnesota. The spruce trees, which are the evergreens growing, begin to take over an aspen-dominated site. So the aspen are those tall, skinny trees that barely have any leaves. So I'll say it again. Spruce begins to take over an aspen-dominated site in northern Minnesota as the short-lived pioneer aspen crowns thin with aging. So notice how much light is able to pour through those crowns and how well the spruce trees are taking over now. All right, beneath the second successional stage species that often form thicker crowns than even the pioneers, new species that are even more shade tolerant become established. This process of succession continues until the most shade tolerant species suitable for the site, also called the climax species as mentioned earlier, become established. What allows the climax species to persist is the fact that the seedlings of these highly shade-tolerant climax species thrive in the shade of their parents. They're able to grow in the shade. Because of this, climax species will persist until disturbance, fire, a bulldozer, a tornado, sets back the succession process to the pioneer or some other stage. Okay, this is the last slide. Remember that primary succession is the succession that occurs when nothing has ever lived there before there's any topsoil. So it's what happens when nothing has grown before. Secondary succession is what occurs when something has been disturbed, when an environment has been disturbed. So it says, again, occurs after a disturbance. It's the same basic process, but because soil and seeds are already present, the process of succession happens more rapidly. These are photos of succession at Mount St. Helens, which erupted in 1980. The mountain didn't cover, it blew ash all over the environment, but it didn't cover the seeds completely. It didn't wipe away all the soil. So it didn't take long for the trees that had originally been present to return to their original locations. That's it.